Good day, everyone. I'm here to present the standards of American Society for Testing Materials, which are developed by committees of relevant industry professionals who meet regularly in an open and transparent process to deliver standards, test methods, specifications, guides, and practices. My name is Russel Santos. Please enjoy and learn from this presentation. As American commerce was increasingly dependent on the rail network tying the country together in the 19th century, there was a prolonged series of accidents that threatened to disturb the Second Industrial Revolution. In response to the issues, engineers and scientists working for the Pennsylvania Railroad formed the American Society for Testing Materials in 1898. The ASTM worked to develop a standard used to fabricate the rails that form the literal backbone of the rapidly expanding rail industry, changing its name in 1902 to become the American Society for Testing and Materials as organization moved beyond exclusive focus on railroad components. In 1961, the acronym became the name and it became ASTM International. Throughout the over 120 years of existence, the organization has developed and published over 12,000 voluntary consensus technical standards that cover a broad range of materials, products, services, and systems. The ASTM defines their standards as a document that has been developed and established within the consensus process of the society and that meets the approval requirements of ASTM procedures and regulations. Those standards are categorized into 6 different types which are defined in the regulations. Test method is a definitive procedure that produces test results. Specifications is an explicit set of requirements to be satisfied by a material, product, system, or service. Classification is a systematic arrangement or division of materials, products, systems, or services into groups based on similar characteristics such as origin, composition, properties, or use. Practice is a definitive set of instructions for performing one or more specific operation that does not include a test result. Guide is a compendium of information or series of options that does not recommend a specific course of action. Terminology is a document comprising definitions of terms, explanation of symbols, abbreviations, or acronyms. The vast majority of standards relate to iron and steel materials, a legacy of its railroad origins. Standards for vigorous type of galvanizations, metal coatings, welded metal tubes, pressured vessel plates exist alongside those for polymer sheets, steel, epoxy-coated steel wire, and borosilicate steel for use in nuclear applications. Going beyond ferric metals, there are standards relating to non-ferrous materials, ceramics, energy, polycarbonates, X-ray testing, textiles, medical devices, environmental technology, sports equipment, and more. Covering this breadth of materials requires the work of many people, and there are 143 different technical writing committees who contributes to the annual publication of standards, which is made up of several volumes. Types of ASTM standards. ASTM standard for test methods provide information description of conducting tests and procedures to determine the properties of a material, a group of materials, or a manufactured product. These standards provide information about test apparatus, specimens, procedures, and any calculations to be conducted during testing. Next is ASTM specification standards provide comprehensive conditions and provisions that a product, a system, or service is required to meet. They also identify different methods of testing that are suitable for testing the criteria. Next is ASTM guide standards provide different instruction but don't recommend a specific course of action depending on individual circumstances. The user then capable of selecting the best option based on instruction. Next is ASTM practice standards designed to provide specific tailored instructions for performing different operations of tasks. Next is ASTM classifications. Standards provide the requirement for assigning different materials, services, or systems into various groups. These requirements may relate to the origin, the physical properties, or the chemical properties, or the chemical properties of the product itself. Next is ASTM technology standards. Provide details about acronym, abbreviation, or symbols that are commonly used in a particular line of business, including different industries. Since chemicals often have different names, there are specific standards that detail common names that scientists can use. Next, I'll discuss why do ASTM safety standards matter. Scientists, engineers, architects, and government agencies rely on ASTM safety standards to ensure the quality and consistency of materials. While these standards are voluntary, they are mandatory when authorities need to cite them in contracts, government codes, regulations, or laws. ASTM standards are crucial in evaluating the material, chemical, mechanical, and metallurgical properties of metals. This information helps guide product manufacturers toward proper processing and application procedures. Next is the mission of ASTM: to be recognized globally as the premier developer and provider of voluntary consensus standards, related technical information, and services that promote public health and safety, support the protection and sustainability of the environment, and overall quality of life, contribute to the reliability of materials, products, systems, and services, and facilitate international, regional, and national commerce. This statement reflects the language of ASTM's character and makes clear the society's commitment to the development and dissemination of high-quality standards and technical information in increasingly diverse fields, and to strengthen the acceptance and use of ASTM international standards in a global environment of international, regional, and national breed. Now, I'll discuss the standard of ASTM. First, ASTM A904, standard specification for 50 nickel, 50 iron powder metallurgy sub-magnetic parts. This specification covers the magnetic properties of 50 nickel, 50 iron part fabricated by power metallurgy techniques, and is intended for parts that require high magnetic permeability, high electrical resistivity, low coercive field strength, and low hysteresis loss. It differs from the wrought alloy specification because these parts are porous. A number of magnetic properties such as permeability are proportional to the sintered density. Magnetic parts shall be tested and adhered to chemical composition, and sintered density requires to which magnetic and residual induction strongly depends on. Parts shall also be tested for their conformance to coercive field strength requirements. The user and producer shall agree upon representative number of specimens for testing. Should the sintered parts be subjected to any secondary operation that causes mechanical strain such as machining or sizing, they should be resintered or annealed. Next is ASTM B1, standard specification for hard-rolled copperware. This specification covers hard-rolled copperware for electrical purposes. The wire shall be tested and shall conform to the requirements as to tensile strength, elongation, and electrical resistivity. No joint shall be made in the completed wire joints in the wire and rod made prior to the final drawing shall be in accordance with the best commercial practice. Next is ASTM B117-2007, Standard Practice for Operating Salt Spray Apparatus. This practice covers the apparatus, procedures, and conditions required to create the salt test environment. The practice does not prescribe the type of test specimen or exposure periods to be used for a specific product, nor the interpretation to be given to the results. This practice provides a controlled corrosive environment which has been utilized to produce relative corrosion resistance information for specimens of metal and coated metals exposed in a given test chamber. The reproducibility of results in the salt spray exposure is highly dependent on the type of specimens tested and the evaluation criteria selected, as well as the control of the operating variables. In any testing program, sufficient replicates should be included to establish the variability of the results. Variability has been observed when similar specimens are tested in different fog chambers, even though the testing conditions are nominally similar and within the range specified in this practice. Next is ASTM B380-2013, Standard Test Method for Corrosion Testing of Decorative Electrodeposited Coating by the Corrode Coat Procedure. This test method covers the corrode coat method of evaluating the corrosion performance of copper, nickel, chromium, and nickel chromium coating electrodeposited on steel, zinc alloys, aluminum alloys, plastics, and other substrates. The test is conducted by applying a slurry containing corrosive salt to test the specimens, allowing the slurry to dry and exposing the specimens coated with the slurry to a high relative humidity for a specified period of time. It is significant as the corrode coat test provides a method of controlling the quality of electroplated articles and is suitable for manufacturing control as well as research and development. Nickel, chromium, and copper, nickel, chromium, electrode-posited coatings are widely used for decorative and protective applications. Next is ASTM B53770, Standard Practice for Rating Electroplated Panels Subjected to Atmospheric Exposure. This practice covers a preferred method for evaluating the condition of electroplated test panels that have been exposed to corrosive environments. For test purposes, it is based on experience in use of the methods with the standard 10 by 15 cm. This method is used with standard size panels exposed on the standard ASTM racks at outdoor test sites in both natural atmospheres and accelerated test conditions. This practice refers only to decorative protective coating that are cathodic to the substrate, such as nickel, chromium, or copper, nickel, chromium on steel or zinc die castings, and is not intended for use with anodic sacrificial coatings such as zinc and cadmium on steel. Any modifications needed to adapt the method to rating actual production parts are not considered here. Panels shall be assigned separate rating numbers based on the ability of the coating to protect the substrate from corrosion and the overall appearance of panels as affected by deterioration of coating itself. Next is ASTM C732, Standard Test Method for Aging Effects of Artificial Weathering on Latex Sealant. This test method covers a laboratory procedure for determination of aging effects of artificial weathering and latex sealant. In this test method, durability is tested when the sealant is used with wood or aluminum. Accelerated weathering exposure serves to indicate long-term exterior durability of the sealant. Next is ASTM C1442, standard practice for conducting tests on sealants using artificial weathering apparatus. This practice covers three types of laboratory weathering exposure procedures for evaluating the effect of actinic radiation, heat, and moisture of sealants. This practice determines the effect of actinic radiation, elevated temperature, and moisture on sealants and their constituents under controlled laboratory artificial weather test conditions. When conducting exposure in devices which use laboratory light source, it is important to consider first how well the artificial test conditions will reproduce property change and failure modes caused by end-use environments on the sealant being tested, and second, the stability ranking of the sealants. Next is ASTM D5010, Standard Guide for Testing Printing Inks and Related Materials. This guide covers a list of test methods, practices, and specifications that can be used for the testing evaluation of printing inks, printed ink films, and substrates used in their productions. This guide includes methods that were developed to test paints, paint films, and substrates but may be adapted for use in testing printing inks and printing matter. Tests on raw materials and analytical methods in general have not been included. Next is ASTM D79220, Standard Test Method for Density and Specific Gravity, Relative Density of Plastic by Displacement. This test method describes the determination of the specific gravity and density of solid plastics in forms such as sheets, rods, tubes, or molded items. The specific gravity or density of a solid is a property that is conveniently measured to identify a material. To follow physical changes in a sample, to indicate degree of uniformity among different sampling units or specimens, or to indicate the average density of a large item. Changes in density of a single material are due to localized differences in crystallinity, loss of plasticity, absorption of solvent, or to other causes. It is possible that portions of a sample differ in density because of their differences in crystallinity, thermal history, or porosity and composition. Next is ASTM D88212, Standard Test Method for Tensile Properties of Thin Plastic Sheeting. These test methods cover determination of tensile properties in the form of thin sheeting and film less than 1 mm in thickness. Tensile properties determined by these test methods are of value for the identification and characterization of materials. For control and specification purposes, tensile properties can vary with specimen thickness, method of preparation, speed of testing, type of grips used, and manner of measuring extension. Tensile properties can be utilized to provide data for research and development and engineering design as well as quality control and specification. However, data from such tests cannot be considered significant for application differing widely from the load time scale of the test employed. Next is ASTM D90499, Standard Practice for Exposure of adhesive specimens to artificial light. This practice covers the basic principles and operating procedures for ultraviolet light, aging of adhesive bonded joints having at least one glass or transparent adherent using fluorescent. This practice is for determining the effects of UV light or UV light and water on adhesive bonded joints. Under controlled but artificial conditions, the results of this practice can be used for comparing the relative durability of several adhesives in a specific laboratory UV exposure. The results obtained may vary when operation conditions are varied within the limit of a given method. Comparisons between materials must only be made when they are tested at the same time in the same instrument. Be sure to accurately report the operation conditions. Next is ASTM D925, Standard Test Method for Rubber Property Staining or Surfaces. These test methods cover techniques to evaluate three types of staining that rubber may cause when in contact with or in proximity to another surface that may be light-colored. Rubber in contact with light-colored organic finishes may stain the surfaces in contact with the rubber, and surfaces adjacent to or beyond the rubber, especially under conditions or heat, pressure, or sunlight. When a light-colored rubber veneer or organic coating covers a staining rubber compound, the staining ingredient can diffuse through the veneer or coating and stain the surface. This staining of light-colored surface is objectionable to the customer. Next is ASTM D173514, Standard Practice for Testing Water Resistant Coatings Using Water Fog Apparatus. This practice covers the basic principles, operating procedures for testing water resistance of coating in an apparatus similar to that used for salt spray testing. Water can cause the degradation of coatings, so knowledge of how a coating resists water is helpful in predicting its service life. Failure in water fog tests may be caused by a number of factors, including a deficiency in the coating itself, contaminating of the substrate, or inadequate surface perforation. The test is therefore useful for evaluating coating alone or complete coating systems. Next is ASTM D279493, Standard Test Method for Resistance of Organic Coating to the Effect of Rapid Deformation. This test method covers a procedures for rapidly deforming by impact a coating film and its substrate for evaluating the effects of such deformation. Coating attached to the substrate are subjected to damaging impacts during the manufacture of artificials and their use in service. In its use over many years, this test method for impact resistance has been found to be useful in predicting the performance of organic coating for their ability to resist cracking caused by impacts. Next is ASTM D5019, Standard Specification for Reinforced Non-Vulcanized Polymeric Sheet Used in Roofing Membrane. This specification covers reinforced non-vulcanized polymeric sheets made from chlorosulfonated polyethylene, intended for use as a single-ply roof membrane exposed to the weather. The sheet shall be reinforced with fiber or fabric. The polymers used in these sheets have been thermoplastic characteristics at time of insulation. The chlorosulfonated polyethylene will vulcanize in place under ambient conditions. Next is ASTM D655100, Standard Practice for accelerated weathering of pressure-sensitive tapes by xenon arc exposure apparatus. This practice describes one environment for the exposure of pressure-sensitive tape used primarily for packaging to a laboratory accelerated weathering environment. This practice describes sample preparation and the art accelerated environment to which it shall be exposed. It does not specify the length of time of the exposure nor what tests shall be performed on the material following the exposure. This also describes one method for accelerated weathering of pressure-sensitive tape, used primarily for packaging. It is not intended for evaluation the weathering characteristics of pressure-sensitive tapes used in long-term outdoor exposure conditions. Astm D6577 Standard Guide for Testing Industrial Protective Coatings. This guide covers the selection and use of test methods and procedure for testing industrial protective coatings. Selections of standards to be allowed must be governed by experience and the requirements in each individual case together with agreement between the supplier and the user. This guide is intended to provide assistance in selecting appropriate tests for evaluating the general performance level to be expected of a coating system on a given substrate exposed to a given type of environment. Surface preparation or cleanliness prior to application of the coating can be critical to the proper performance of the coating. Results obtained in the test cited in this guide may not be adequate for predicting coating service life of a specific coating system in specific environmental exposure. A suitable control coating system of known performance in the service environment should be included in the testing for comparison. Next is ASTM D6666201 Standard Specification for Polyolefin-Based Plastic Lumber Decking Boards. This specification covers polyolefin-based plastic lumber products for use as exterior residential decking boards. Plastic lumber products are currently made predominantly with recycled polyolefin plastics, where the products are more or less non-homogeneous in the cross-section. However, this specification is also potentially applicable to similar manufactured plastic products made from other plastics and plastic composite materials that have non-homogeneous cross-section. Next is ASTM D669503B Standard Practice for Xenon Arc Exposure of Paint and Related Coatings. This practice covers the selection of test conditions for accelerated exposure testing of coatings and related products in xenon arc devices conducted according to practices G151 and G155. This practice also covers the preparation of test specimens, the test conditions suited for coatings, and the evaluation of test results. Next is ASTM D25610 Standard Test Method for Determining the Isode Pendulum Impact Resistance of Plastics. These test methods cover the determination of the resistance of plastic to standardized pendulum-type hammers mounted in standardized machines in breaking standard specimens with one pendulum swing. The standard test for these test methods requires specimens made with a mild notch. Since this method permits a variation in the width of the specimens, and since the width dictates for many materials whether a brittle low-energy break or a ductile high-energy break will occur, it is necessary that the width be stated in the specification covering that material and that the width be reported along with the impact resistance. In view of the preceding, one should not make comparisons between data from specimens having width that differ by more than a few miles. Next is ASTM D297 2015 Standard Test Methods for Rubber Products Chemical Analysis. These test methods cover the qualitative and quantitative analysis of the composition of rubber products of the R family. Many of these test methods may be applied to the analysis of natural and synthetic crude rubbers. These methods are divided into general and specific test methods. General test methods shall be performed to determine the amount of type of some or all of the major constituents of a rubber product, and all include determination of rubber polymer content by the indirect method, determination of density, and extract sulfur fillers and ash analysis. Specific test methods, on the other hand, shall be performed to determine specific rubber polymers present in a rubber product such as crude, unvulcanized, reclaimed, and vulcanized rubbers. Next, ASTM D638 Standard Test Method for Tensile Properties of Plastics. This test method covers the determination of the tensile properties of unreinforced and reinforced plastics in the form of standard double-shaped test specimens when tested under defined conditions of pretreatment temperature, humidity, and testing machine speed. This test method is designed to produce tensile property data for the control and specification of plastic materials. These data are also useful for qualitative characterization for research and development. Tensile properties provide useful data for plastic engineering design purposes. However, because of high degree of sensitivity exhibited by many plastics to rate of straining and environmental conditions, data obtained by this test method cannot be considered valid for applications involving load time scales or environment widely different from those of this test method. Next is ASTM D648 Standard Test Method for Deflection Temperature of Plastics under Flexural Load in the edgewise position. This test method covers the determination of the temperature at which an arbitrary deformation occurs when specimens are subjected to an arbitrary set of testing conditions. This test is particularly suited to control and develop work. Data obtained by this test method shall not be used to predict the behavior of plastic materials at elevated temperature except in applications in which the factors of time, temperature, method of loading, and fiber stress are similar to those specified in this test method. The data are not intended for use in design or predicting endurance at elevated temperatures. Next is ASTM D1670 Standard Test Method for Failure Endpoint in Accelerated and Outdoor Weathering of Bituminous Materials. This test method covers the use of a spark generating apparatus for determination of failure due to cracking of bituminous materials undergoing accelerated or outdoor weathering on electrically conductive backings. The extent of cracking or pitting of bitumen films is a measure of the extent of deterioration due to weathering. Failure due to cracking is more accurately determined electrically than visually. Next is ASTM D358095 Standard Test Methods for Vibration Test of Products. These test methods cover the determination of resonance of unpacked products and components of unpacked products by means of vertical linear motion at the surface on which the product is mounted for tests. Two alternate test methods are presented. Test method A: resonance search using sinusoidal vibration, and test B method: resonance searching using random vibration. Products are exposed to complex dynamic stress in the transportation environment. The determination of the resonant frequencies of the product may aid the packaging designer in determining the proper packaging system to provide adequate protection for the product, as well as providing an understanding of the complex interactions between the components of the product as they relate to expected transportation vibration inputs. Next is Astm D34241, standard practice for evaluating the relative light fastness and weatherability of printed matter. This practice describes one environment for the exposure of pressure-sensitive tape, used primarily for packaging to a laboratory accelerated weathering environment. Next is ASTM D363812, standard test method for comparative tracking index of electrical insulating materials. These test methods evaluate in a short period of time low voltage up to 600 volt, track resistance or comparative tracking index of materials in the presence of aqueous contaminants. Electrical equipment can fail as a result of electrical tracking of insulating materials that is exposed to various contaminating environments and surface conditions. This method is an accelerated test which, at relatively low test voltages, provides a comparison of the performance of insulating materials under wet and contaminated conditions. The comparative tracking index is not related directly to the suitable operating voltage in surface. Next is ASTM D3794-2013, standard guide for testing coil coatings. This guide covers procedures for testing coil coatings. The test methods are listed in Table 1, where more than one test method is listed for the same characteristics. No attempts is made to indicate superiority of one method over another. Selection of test methods to be followed must be governed by the requirements in each individual case, together with agreement between the producer and user. This guide represents a collection of pertinent ASTM test methods used within the coil coating industry. In the past, coil coaters worldwide depended on the industry standards written by the National Coil Coating Association. That association, working cooperatively with ASTM, will no longer issue new nor update old standards. Next is ASTM D4-32921, standard practice for fluorescent ultraviolet lamp apparatus exposure of plastics. This practice covers specific procedures and test conditions that are applicable for using fluorescent UV lamp and water apparatus exposure of plastics conducted in accordance with practices G151 and G154. This practice also covers the preparation of test specimens, the test conditions best suited for plastics, and the evaluation of test results. The ability of a plastic material to resist deterioration caused by exposure to light, heat, and water is property of significance in many applications. This practice is intended to induce property changes associated with end-use conditions, including the effect of ultraviolet solar irradiance, moisture, and heat. The exposure used in this practice is not intended to simulate the deterioration caused by localized weather phenomena such as atmospheric pollution, biological attack, and saltwater exposure. And the last one is ASTM D4-35514, Standard test method for deterioration of geotextiles by exposure to light, moisture, and heat in a xenon arc type apparatus. This test method covers the determination of the deterioration in tensile strength of geotextile by exposure to xenon arc radiation, moisture, and heat. This method is intended to induce property changes associated with end-use conditions, including the effect of solar radiation, moisture, and heat. The exposure used is not intended to simulate the deterioration caused by localized weather phenomena such as atmospheric pollution, biological attack, and saltwater exposure. That wraps up some of the ASTM standards. I hope you learned something from this presentation.
Part E in Terminology in ASTM Standard. Introduction. ASTM standard terminology is written to promote three objectives. 1. Precise understanding and interpretation of ASTM standards. 2. Standardization of terminology in standards, reports, and other technical writings. And 3. Explanation of the meanings of technical terms for benefit of those not conversant with them. For terminology to be effective, it should be consistently. It is therefore the responsibility of each technical committee to manage terminology usage in all standards for which it has jurisdiction to ensure that usage is consistent both within the committee and society. Part E provides guidance to technical committees and to those who review the work of technical committees regarding the principles of terminology. E1 Terminology Management. E1.1 in ASTM International, technical committees are responsible for defining terminology within technical standards and for developing terminology as a type of standard. Terminology ensures precise interpretation of ASTM standards and explains technical terms for the benefit of users who are not conversant with the language of the standard. Use terminology that is clear, explicit, and not liable to misinterpretation when referred to technical operations, commercial contracts, or legal proceedings. E1.2 Terminology in technical and standard may include definitions of terms and definition of terms specific to a standard, and explanation of symbols, abbreviations, and acronyms that are necessary for the reader to understand that particular standard. E1.3 All technical standards should contain a terminology section that includes definitions of terms or definition of terms specific to a standard or both. Reference to related terminology standards can be sufficient for this section. E1.4 All technical committees should develop and maintain a general terminology standard. Terminology as a type of standard is comprised of definition of terms and explanation of symbols, abbreviations, and acronyms pertaining to the scope of technical committee or a specialized field within the committee. E2 Definition of terms and definition terms of terms specific to a standard. E2.1 The distinction between definition of terms and definition of terms specific to a standard is related to the degree of application. If a term has a meaning more specialized than its commonly used language, is used by two or more subcommittees within a committee, or appears in several standards, it is labeled as definition of a term. When the term is limited in application to the standard in which it needs to be defined, it is labeled as definition of a term to a specific standard. Definition of terms and definition of terms specific to standard appear to separate subsections within of the terminology section of technical standard. Since definition of terms is specific to standard have limited application, they do not generally appeal in technical committee's general terminology standard. E2.1.1 An example of definition is dolly, a low platform or structure or casters designed primarily for moving bulky loads for short distances. E3 Guidelines for writing definitions of terms and definitions of terms specific to a standard. E3.1 Use these guidelines when writing both definition of terms and definitions of terms specific to a standard. E3.2 Prefer a definition when. E3.3 2.1. Any term used in a standard is essential to the interpretation and application of standard. E3.2.2. A term used in a standard is not adequately defined in common language. E3.2.3. Using qualitative adjectives and nouns that could be taken to denote or connote an absolute, unqualified, or unconditional property or capability. For example, waterproof, stainless, unbreakable, vapor barrier, gas-free, flat, safe, rigid, pure. Such qualitative adjectives and nouns shall not be used unless actually used and defined in their absolute sense. Describing a quantitative determinable property or capability that might cause misinterpretation or confusion. For example, strong, high, accurate, clean. Do not develop a definition when a term is adequately defined in reference source material, print or electronic version, unless a definition is required for clarity. A term has a well-recognized authoritative meaning, such a term defined in the International System of Units. A term is defined acceptably for the committee's purposes in the ASTM Online Dictionary of Engineering, Science, and Technology, or committee's terminology standard. A term that meets the committee needs has been defined in technical standard of another committee or subcommittee. E4. Form of a definition. Write definition of terms and definitions specific to a standard in dictionary definition form. Include term, part of speech, definition, and when applicable, a delimiting phrase. Describe the essential characteristics of term. Keep it simple. Do not include irrelevant details such as how things are made, used, or measured. State the definition without repeating the entire term defined. Use language that is understandable to non-experts. Discussion. A defined term could be a word, phrase, or compound word. A compound word or a phrase may require the use of one of those base words within the definition. Complete the definition in one sentence. If two or more phrases are needed to state the meaning, connect them with semicolons. Include any necessary supplementary information as discussion. The term and its elements should appear in the following order: term, abbreviation, symbol, dimensions of quantities, measurement units, parts of speech, delimiting phrase, statement of meaning, including specification limits, where applicable, cross-reference to synonyms or related terms, attribution. E5. Elements of a term. Abbreviations. For terms usually represented by an abbreviation, place a comma and the preferred abbreviation following the term, and then the part of speech, for example, average, AVG. Symbols. For terms usually represented by a letter symbol, place a comma and preferred symbol following the term, and then the part of speech. Follow the style guidance in section G16. For example, ampere, capital A. Parts of speech. Including the part of speech enables the user to distinguish between closely allied terms. For example, flame resistance, the ability to withstand flame impeachment or give protection from it. Flame resistant, adjective, hedging flame resistance. Delimiting phrases. If a term has different meanings in other technical fields or contexts, include an italicized phrase that delimits the definition to field of application. This phrase should follow the dash and separated from the basic statement of meaning by comma. For example, beam, in a balance, the horizontal span support. Beam, in a building, a horizontal load carrying structural member of building frame. Beam, in optics, a concentrated and directional flow of radiant energy. Specification limits. If a definition involves specification limits applicable only to a specific standard. For example, in defining plate by specifying a thickness range, make the term specific to that standard. If, however, it is intended that this definition be broadly accepted within specific technical committee or within ASTM International, then limit scope. For example, plate, aluminum products, a rolled flat product of thickness 6.4 mm, 0.25 inches or greater. Cross-references. Cross-references bring together related terms and narrower terms of given genus. A cross-reference may take the place of definition or may be appended into a definition to draw a related definition. For example, flatbed, sea truck. Discussions. To fill in more detail of the concept being defined, supplementary information may be added as separate discussion, immediately following the definition. For example, builder's model, a reference standard of quality for specific building components denoting, by example, the level of quality adopted by builder. 3.1.1. Discussion. The examples or samples construction material permit examination of quality level. Attribution. If an existing definition is adopted from another reference and source materials, for example, technical standard, manual, or dictionary, copy it exactly and identify the original source in boldface notation at the right margin following the definition. Notify headquarters that permission to publish shall be obtained from organization holding copyright. The definition shall not be published without permission. E6. Use of symbols, acronyms, and abbreviations as terminology. In standards containing numerous symbols, acronyms, or abbreviations, this item may be listed under the appropriate subheading as convenience to the user of standard. Symbols. List the symbols alphabetically. Do not assign a number or capitalize the explanation. For example, symbols, a cross-sectional area, specimen, M2B, magnetic induction. CP, heat capacity at constant temperature. Acronym. An acronym is a shortened form of a compound term that uses initial letters of the term to make a pronounceable word. Alphabetically list and capitalize the acronyms. In few cases, acronyms are written in lowercase, such as laser and sonar. Do not capitalize the explanation unless it's a proper noun. For example, acronyms. PERT, PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. Radio, radar, radio detecting and raging. Abbreviations. An abbreviation is a shortened form of word phrase. This the abbreviation. Do not include abbreviation appearing in the section G3. Do not capitalize the explanation unless it is a proper noun. For example, abbreviations: ASSN, association, AVG, average. Form of a terminology standard. Subject headings of text. The following list shows in sequence the subject usually covered in a terminology standard. First, title, mandatory, designation, mandatory, scope, mandatory, significance and use, terminology, terms and definitions, mandatory, symbols, abbreviations, acronyms, keywords, mandatory, annexes, appendixes, bibliography or references, summary of changes. Title, mandatory. The title should be as concise as possible but complete enough to identify the subject covered by the terminology. The title of terminology standard preferably is terminology of, although terminology relating to is acceptable. Designation. The designation will be assigned by ASTM International Headquarters upon submittal of the standard for society approval. E10. Scope. Mandatory. Provide information about the field of application of the terminology. Include information on how, when, and by whom the terminology will be used. Indicate here whether the terminology standard is general or relates to a specialized field. Where the content of a terminology standard is limited or restricted, as in a specialized terminology standard, the scope statement should so indicate. Reference documents. Include this section only ASTM standards, adjuncts, and standards or codes of other organizations. All reference documents shall be cited. Provide footnotes to this section to indicate the sources of these documents. Do not include the year date when designating reference documents unless there is technical reason for specifying a particular year date. When listing reference adjuncts, provide a brief description in the section and a footnote of their availability. E12. Significance and use. When use restrictions exist, Include a significance and use statement. Give a warning of them such as this terminology is not intended to. Terminology mandatory. Terms and their definitions mandatory. Compose a definition in the dictionary defining definition form CE 4.5 and include the term part of speech definition and when applicable a delimiting phrase. Boldface the term and italize the part of speech and delimiting phrase. Do not capitalize the term or any other components of definition except for other proper nouns, acronyms, or any other words capitalized in normal usage. List the terms unnumbered and in alphabetical sequence. Although the preferred style of listing terms and their definition is applicable is alphabetical sequence, in some cases it may be desirable to show the relationships in logical family of concepts by grouping definitions according to classification system. Place narrower or subordinate terms and their definition in alphabetical order under the definition of the broader term as the main entry. Symbols, acronyms, and abbreviations. Any kind of these subsections can be used for the convenience of users of the standard. Follow the guidelines detailed in section E6. Keywords. In this section, identify the words, terms, or phrases that best represent the technical information presented in the standard. Select the keywords from the title and body of the document and include the general, vernacular, and trade terms. These keywords will be used in preparation of ASTM subject index. Select 3 or more keywords that describe the names of test procedures, special materials, or specific applications that will facilitate the identification and retrieval of the standards. Keywords for terminology standards should include the words definition and terminology. Annexes and appendices. To aid in understanding and using the terminology, supplementary information such as illustrations, commentaries, or rationale may be included in annexes, mandatory information, or appendixes, non-mandatory information. Bibliography or references. Supplementary publications useful for consultation by users who wish to have more detailed information on the particular terminology may be provided. If the publications are cited in the text, they should be listed in the reference section at the end of the standard. See section A to 5. Otherwise, the section should be titled Bibliography. Summary of changes. The unnumbered section shall be placed at the end of the standard and begin with the following introductory paragraph. Next, list by the section of the subsection changes since the last issue that may impact the use of standard. Brief descriptions of changes and reasons for the changes may be included. An example of the list of changes is added the term bioconcentration. 2. Revise scope. 3. Modified the definition of sediment. Part F. Caveats and other legal aspects in standards. Special instructions. Introduction. This section contains special instructions for the use of commercial contractual statements, caveats, patents, trademarks, specific sources of supply, references to other organizations, etc. in standards. When a standard contains any one of these statements or references, the committee shall obtain the necessary guidance from ASTM International Headquarters for the inclusion in the standard. F1. Commercial contractual items in standards. Certain requirements such as those listed below shall not be included in ASTM standards. If a committee feels it is important that this type of information be given, the committee may request an exemption from the Committee on Standards for the inclusion of such requirements in ASTM standard. Adjustment, settlement, and investigation of claims. Cost of testing, retesting statements, effective dates, open-end agreements, prices, purchasing. The matter of who shall pay for the services should be stated in the agreement on purchase order and not the standard. Statements covering inspection follow section B19. Rejection rehearing follow section B20. Testing and retesting follow B16.2, marking follow B22, and certification follow section B21, are suitable when they do not contain mandatory requirement covering the costs involved. F2. Caveat statements and policies in standards. The genetic caveat on safety hazards specified below shall appear in the scope section of 1. Test methods. 2. Specifications, where the test methods are detailed other than by reference. And 3. Practices and guides that involve the use of material, operations, or equipment. This standard does not support to address of all the safety concerns, if any, associated with its use. It is the responsibility of the user of these standards to establish appropriate safety, health, and environmental practices and determine the applicability of regulatory limitations prior to use. When the standard does not involve the use of hazardous materials, operations, or equipment, a request for an exception to the inclusion of the generic caveat shall be presented to the ASTM Standing Committee on Standards. Specific warning statements shall be included in the standard, see section A13. For the use of warning statements, these statements shall not be prescribed specific remedial measures and actions. However, reference may be made to authoritative sources where reliable information concerning remedial measures can be obtained. Where they exist in a standard specific warning statements, reference to an appropriate section shall be made following the generic safety hazards caveat in the scope. Wait lang. Fire standards. Every fire standard shall state its purpose, specify the known limitations of the standard, and specify the significance of the data that are generated, including relevance to human life and property where appropriate. Use precise terminology use. See Part E terminology in ASTM standards, and include the appropriate caveat as listed below. Standards should include, when practical, sufficient background or explanatory material to guide users in properly applying ASTM fire standards. ASTM fire standards include fire test response standards, fire hazard assessment standards, and fire risk assessment standards. Other types of fire standards shall also be permitted, including terminologies, guides, specifications, and practices. The following criteria shall be followed by fire standards. Fire test response standards provide a means for measuring the response of material, products, or assemblies to heat and flame under controlled conditions of test. ASTM fire test response standard shall contain the following caveat. This standard is used to measure and describe the response of materials, products, or assemblies to heat and flame under controlled conditions, but does not by itself incorporate all factors required for fire hazard or fire risk assessment of the materials, products, or assemblies under actual fire conditions. Fire hazard assessment standards provide a method for assessing the potential for harm for materials, products, or assemblies that can be anticipated under specified fire conditions. ASTM fire hazard assessment standard shall contain the following statement. This standard is used to predict or provide a quantitative measure of fire hazard from a specified set of fire conditions involving specific materials, products, or assemblies. This assessment does not necessarily predict the hazard of actual fires, which involve conditions other than those assumed in analysis. Fire risk assessment standards provide a method for assessing the probability of loss resulting from a given fire situation, involving interaction between the material, product, or assembly with its environment. ASTM fire risk assessment standard shall contain the following statement. This standard also is used established to combining the potential for harm in fire scenarios with probabilities of occurrence of those scenarios. Assessment of fire risk using this standard depends upon many factors, including the manner in which the user selects scenarios and uses them to represent all scenarios relevant to the application. This standard cannot be used to assess fire risk if any specifications are different from those contained in the standard. ASTM developed fire standards other than fire test response standards, fire hazard assessment standards, or fire risk assessment standards, which provide information on fire issues that is not associated with a quantitative output. Where quantitative outputs include a binary pass, fail option, or classification into categories, such ASTM fire standard shall contain the following statement. This fire standard cannot be used to provide quantitative measures. The following generic caveat is appropriate for fire standards that do not describe a fire, tests but do produce quantitative results that are calculated measures of fire test response characteristics and not by themselves measures of fire hazard or fire risk. This standard is used to determine certain fire test response of materials, products, or assemblies to heat and flame under controlled conditions. By using results obtained from fire test response standards, the results obtained from using this standard do not by themselves constitute measures of fire hazard or fire risk. The following caveat is required for fire test methods. Fire testing is inherently hazardous. Adequate safeguards for personnel and property shall be employed in conducting these tests. Titles and criteria for fire hazards and fire risk assessments standards. All standards developed, approved, or reapproved for the analysis and control of fire hazard or fire risk shall contain the words fire hazard assessment or fire risk assessment in the title. The result of such assessment shall be expressed in terms that relate the item in question to anticipated fire environment. When appropriate, this standard may also contain acceptance or classification criteria and a statistical sampling plan as guide to its use. ASTM Committee E05 on fire standards is available to provide of fire standards developed by other ASTM committees. General policy caveat: the Board of Directors approved the inclusion of general statement of ASTM policy in all standards. This standard is subject to revision at any time by the responsible technical committee and must be reviewed every 5 years and if not, revised. Either approved or withdrawn, your comments are invited either for revision of these standards or for additional standards and should be addressed to ASTM International Headquarters. Your comments will receive careful consideration at a meeting of the responsible technical committee, which you may attend. If you feel that your comments have not received a fair hearing, you should make your views known to ASTM Committee on Standards 100 Bar Harbor Drive West, Conshohocken, PA 19428. This statement shall appear in the note at the end of standard following the note of ASTM disclaimer of liability as to patented inventions. See Section F3 on patents in ASTM standards. Working document caveat: the Board of Directors approved the use of working document statement to be stated on the front page of every draft document or manuscript from a committee. The following statement shall be typed or stamped on the document. This document is not ASTM standard. It is under consideration with an ASTM technical committee but has not received all approval required to become an ASTM standard. You agree not to reproduce or circulate or quote in whole or in part in this document outside of ASTM Committee of Society activities or submit it to any other organization or standards, whether national, international, or other, except with the approval of chair of the committee having jurisdiction and the written authorization of the president of the society. If you do not agree with these conditions, please immediately destroy all the copies. Document copyright ASTM International 100 Bar Harbor Drive West, Conshohocken, PA 19428. All rights reserved. Professional judgment caveat: when a technical committee is developing a standard guide or practice that may involve professional judgment, the following caveats may be used. Standard guide: this guide offers an organized collection of information or a series of options and does not recommend a specific course of action. This document cannot replace education or experience and should be used in conjunction with professional judgment. Not all aspects of this guide may be applicable in all circumstances. This ASTM standard is not intended to represent or replace the standard of care by which the adequacy of a given professional service must be judged. Nor should this document be applied without consideration of a project's many unique aspects. The word standard in the title of this document means only that the document has been approved through ASTM consensus process. Standard practice: this practice offers set of instructions performing one of the or more specific operations. These documents cannot replace education or experience and should be used in conjunction with professional judgment. Not all aspects of this practice may be applicable in all circumstances. In this ASTM standard is not intended to represent or replace the standard of care by which adequacy of given professional service must be judged, nor should the document be applied without consideration of project's many unique aspects. The word standard na title means only the documents been approved through ASTM consensus process. Mercury caveat: when a standard includes reference to element of mercury or products containing mercury, the following caveat shall appear in the scope section. Warning: Mercury has been designated by many regulatory agencies such as hazardous substance that can cause serious medical issues. Mercury or its vapor has been demonstrated to be hazardous to health and corrosive to materials. Use caution when handling mercury and mercury-containing products. See the applicable product safety data sheets for additional information. The potential exists that selling mercury or mercury-containing products or both is prohibited by local or national law. Users must determine legality of sales in their location. Patents in ASTM standards. When a patent committee has determined an item covered by a patent or pending patent may be necessary in a proposed standard, the committee shall include a statement in the balloting process and a footnote in the draft standard indicating a willingness to consider alternatives. ASTM standards submitted to ANSI for approval as American National Standards shall conform to the ANSI patent policy. The ANSI patent policy may be obtained on the ANSI website. Statement in balloting process. The statement with ballot shall include a request for alternatives as follows. The name of the material, product, process, apparatus is covered by a patent. If you are aware of an alternatives to the patented item, please attach to your ballot return a description of alternatives. All suggestions will be considered by committee. If alternatives are identified, the committee shall reconsider whether the patented item is necessary. The committee in making its decision shall follow Regulation 15. Statement in footnote of standard. A footnote shall be included in the standard as follows. The name of material, product, process, apparatus, and may include the patent number for reference is covered by a patent. Interested parties are invited to submit information regarding the identification of alternatives to this patented item in ASTM International headquarters. Your comments will be received careful consideration at a meeting of responsible technical committee which you may attend. The footnote shall be cited in the specific section of the standard where the patented item is first mentioned. Information describing the patented item will be set forth once in the standard in this footnote. Disclaimer of liability as to patented inventions. Neither ASTM International nor ASTM Committee shall be responsible for identifying all patents under which a license is required in using ASTM document or for conducting inquiries into the legal validity of those patents which are brought to society's attention. Where applicable, an ASTM document shall include a note word as follows. ASTM International takes no position respecting the validity of any patent rights asserted in connection with any item mentioned in this standard. User of this standard express advice that determination of validity of any such patent rights and the risk of infringement of such rights are entirely their own responsibility. Use of trademarks and specific sources of supply for apparatus, reagents, and materials in ASTM standards. ASTM International is authorized to certify products, equipment, or services. ASTM International has registered certification mark along other registered marks. ASTM International does not permit its trademark to be used in manner that suggests it has approved any product, equipment, or services other than relation to an ASTM certification program. ASTM International does not permit the use of third-party trade or service marks in ASTM standards in a manner that could suggest ASTM International endorsement, approval, sponsorship, or certification of the trademark item or service. F4.2 Trademarks. Trademark shall not be used in ASTM standards unless the trademark is used to refer to a specific source of supply and such use conforms to the requirement of F4.3. Trademarks in ASTM standards shall not be used in a manner that is false or misleading, violates the rights of mark's owner, violates any law, regulation, or other public policy, or mischaracterizes the relationship between the society and the material, product, system, or service represented by the mark, including but not limited to use of any mark that might be reasonably be construed as an endorsement, approval, sponsorship, or certification by the society of mark that might reasonably be product, system, or service, or that might be reasonably purchase or utilize the material, product, system, or service represented by the mark. Judgment is the sole discretion of the Committee of Standards. If ASTM International staff decides permission should be obtained to use a trademark, such permission shall be obtained by Astm International Headquarters from the holder of the mark. The first reference to the trademark in the standard shall include a footnote containing the name of the trademark holder. Trademark symbols shall not be included. Trademark shall be used as an adjective. Sources of supply. To allow the widest possible use of ASTM standards, it is the responsibility of the sponsoring committee to ensure that sources of supply exist for unique and difficult to obtain apparatus, reagents, and materials. Reference to specific commercial sources of supply are permitted only when this is sole source of supply. Information on the sole source of supply shall be included in the footnote. Include wording such as the sole source of supply of the apparatus known to be committee at this time is name and address of the supplier. If you are aware of alternative suppliers, please provide this information to ASTM International Headquarters. Your comments will receive careful consideration at a meeting of the responsible technical committee, which you may attend. If the apparatus is not widely available but more than one source supply is known, or if apparatus that is widely available needs to be checked for sustainability in the application specified, the committee can reference criteria for evaluating apparatus. This reference can be a section of the standard, to separate existing standard or other published document, or can be in the form of an annex or appendix to the standard, or filed an ASTM research report or adjunct. The text referencing the availability of such criteria and any requirement of use of such criteria should be included in the appropriate section of the standard. Include wording such as all available apparatus may be suitable for this application. Apparatus considered for use in this application shall be checked for sustainability in accordance with the requirement of insert reference to appropriate evaluation document. F5. Reference to standards of other organizations. When referencing standards of other organizations, include the designation of and title for document in the reference documents. In all cases, information on the title, designation of source, availability of the reference standard shall be included. Do not include the year date of reference documents unless there is a technical reason for requiring a particular revision. In all cases, information on the title, designation, and source availability of the reference standard shall be included. Do not include the year date of reference documents unless there is a technical reason for requiring a particular revision. Joint logo shall be printed on ASTM standards except with the authorization of the Board of Directors. When a standard has been developed in cooperation with another organization, a note may appear in the standard crediting the other organization participation. In cases of disagreement on implementation of this policy, the matter shall be referred to Committee on Standard for decisions.